As the American soldiers approached Ohrdruf concentration camp, they could smell the camp before they saw it. The advancing US Army had led to many German soldiers to flee the concentration camp, but they inflicted one final horrific execution at the site, as they executed dozens of prisoners, and the ground was still wet with the blood of the final victims of the SS Guards of Ohrdruf. One of the bodies was that of an American, a US Air Force pilot, who had been carried out on a stretcher and was then shot in the head. Ohrdruf was the first Nazi concentration camp which was liberated by the Americans, and all around the site they found horror, execution and death. It's believed that in the subcamp of Buchenwald, thousands of people were killed and were executed. But there were a number of reprisal killings inflicted upon the SS Guards that remained, and some of the prisoners even turned on the SS Guards. Today we look at the executions of the Ohrdruf Liberation Reprisals. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Ohrdruf concentration camp was established in November 1944, close to the town it was named after. It was to begin with a forced labour camp before it became a subcamp of the Buchenwald complex. The camp supplied prisoners to work on a planned railway construction project and for a huge communications centre in the basement of the nearby Mühlberg Castle. Prisoners had to connect the castle to the main railroad line and dig tunnels in nearby mountains. Around 10,000 prisoners were held there by the later part of 1944, and then months later, in early 1945, the total number of prisoners was around 20,000. There were no beds, but instead blood-covered straw infested with lice, and the prisoners were housed in huts, stables, and even tents. The workdays were stretched to 14 hours, and many prisoners died from the conditions of the work, as well as a lack of sanitary facilities and medical care. They also had insufficient food and clothes for the weather. The guards of the camp were helped out by those who were sent from Auschwitz to bolster the violent regime inflicted upon the inmates. Some historians believe that the prisoners were making a facility which would later be a testing site for a German nuclear bomb or for other wonder weapons. Those who could not work there were sent to other camps, but as the Americans began to arrive in the area around Ohrdruf, huge evacuations took place as prisoners were sent on death marches. During these marches, members of the SS and Hitler Youth killed roughly 1,000 prisoners, and mass graves were later disturbed as the SS tried to burn the corpses to reduce them to ashes and then conceal their crimes. The SS guards also killed many who would not walk and shot them in the open. There were also roughly 3,000 prisoners who died from the work inside of Ohrdruf, as well as the murder they suffered at the hands of the violent guards, putting a rough death toll on the short-lived camp at 7,000. On the 4th of April 1945, Ohrdruf was liberated by the US 4th Armoured Division, with Brigadier General Joseph Cutrona commanding, and also the 89th Infantry Division in support. But what the US soldiers found was shocking. One young US private said, "We drove in, and between the gates and the barracks were 30 dead, the blood still wet from the departing German guards." There were bodies piled up high in the sheds, and many were partially burned. The liberators were scarred for life with what they saw, and even General Patton, Eisenhower and Bradley arrived to survey the camp. Eisenhower claimed that the most interesting, although horrible, sight that I encountered during the trip was a visit to the German internment camp near Gotha. The things I saw beg a description. When I was touring the camp, I had encountered 3 men who had been inmates, and by one route or another had made their escape. I interviewed them through an interpreter. The visual evidence and the verbal testimony of starvation, cruelty, and bestiality was so overpowering as to leave me a bit sick. In one room, where they were, piled up 20 or 30 naked men, killed by starvation. General Patton would not even enter. He said he would get sick if he did so. I made the visit deliberately, in order to be in a position to give first-hand evidence of these things if ever, in the future, there develops a tendency to charge these allegations merely to propaganda. Another liberating soldier claimed, "We walked into a shed, and the bodies were piled up like wood. There is no other words to describe it." General Patton recounted in his diary that, in a shed was a pile of about 40 completely naked human bodies, in the last stages of emaciation. These bodies were lightly sprinkled with lime, not for the purpose of destroying them, but for the purpose of removing the stench. When the shed was full, I presume its capacity to be about 200, the bodies were taken into a pit a mile from the camp, where they were then buried. The inmates claimed that 3,000 men who had either been shot in the head or who had died from starvation had been buried since the 1st of January. When we began to approach with our troops, the Germans thought it expedient to remove the evidence of their crime. Therefore they had some of the slaves exhume the bodies and place them on a mammoth griddle composed of 60cm railway tracks laid on brick foundations. They poured pitch onto the bodies and then built a fire of pine wood and coal underneath them. They were not very successful in their operations because there was a huge pile of human bones, skulls, charred torsos on or under the griddle, which must have accounted for many hundreds. There were corpses everywhere, and the sights the American guards found inside the camp scarred their minds. But there were a few SS guards who had remained. The camp, as mentioned, had been almost completely evacuated, but there were some SS guards who were found, and these were then rounded up and were captured by the American forces. Most of the SS men had fled, but there were a few, for some reason, who had chosen to remain. Some may have even tried to masquerade as prisoners to save their own skin, like what happened inside other camps such as Bergen-Belsen. The SS guards had slaughtered a number of prisoners before they left, but the Americans did get their hands on a few of the guards. As the camp was liberated, US Army photographers captured the harrowing scenes and the bodies scattered everywhere. But they also photographed a number of bodies of SS guards who had been battered and killed. In one image there are 2 SS guards who seemingly look as if they're wearing civilian clothing or prisoner clothing, leading to the conclusion that these men remained at Ohrdruf to hide out amongst those who were still there. These 2 men had a harrowing final few moments, as it is clear they were battered and brutalised. They both have incredibly bruised and purple faces, which are heavily bloodied. It's likely that the US soldiers and liberators wanted to inflict some instant revenge for what happened at the camp, and battered and brutalised these men beyond recognition. One of the SS guards has a huge lump on his forehead, and his head is completely purple. But also their bodies contain many bullet holes close to their heart, showing that they were killed and executed by the rifles or machine guns of probably the Americans. On one of the guards' bodies, there are at least 7 bullet holes close to the heart on the man's chest. Some of the wounds could have been done posthumously also, as soldiers carried out instant reprisal for what they had seen. The men's bodies were left out in the open, but this was just one example of a reprisal killing of the SS guards of Ohrdruf. Another SS guard who was at the camp was captured by prisoners, and he was subjected to very similar treatment. Those inmates who remained tore the clothes from his body and battered and beat him to a bloody pulp. Many of the American guards would have turned their back to this, and scattered around this man's body are a number of heavy stones and rocks, leading to the conclusion that he was probably battered to death by these weapons, being smashed over the head with them. This was the same for an SS guard of the camp who was set upon by Soviet prisoners, and his body lies in a ditch with rocks scattered all around him, his lifeless corpse still clothed, as he still had his boots on him. Another guard who was killed had a swastika carved into his chest, as his body was left on the ground, with prisoners and soldiers standing around him, and his head covered in pools of blood. There were a number of others, and there was also a female guard who was subjected to this sort of treatment. This woman was either killed by the prisoners of the camp or by the US liberators. Her remains were battered and bruised, and she appears to have been struck around the face repeatedly, as there are cuts and bruises on her face. There also appears to be a bullet wound in her stomach, and presumably another few bullet holes, leading to the conclusion that she was probably shot by US forces, as the prisoners did not have access to this weaponry. This unknown woman was one of the only female guards of the concentration camps, who when liberated was executed immediately by soldiers or by prisoners. The bullet holes indicate that it would have been US soldiers who at least finished this woman off. The excuse for this would have been that it was instant reprisal and revenge for the horrors they inflicted upon the prisoners. Today the only structures that remain of the Ohrdruf camp are some of the munitions bunkers, which were used to house a number of the inmates. The horrors that the US liberating forces found haunted the memory of those, and the images of the slaughter were printed all around the world, and in the final weeks of the Second World War, the evils of Ohrdruf and the SS cemented the terrifying actions of the Nazi Party, and that those liberators were fighting against evil. But the US forces did allow a number of brutal reprisals, and took part in some executions against the guards of the camp that they discovered. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.